Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Bill Conkle. I am on the K-12 literacy team here at Amplify, and I'm so glad that you all have decided to join us today. October is Dyslexia Awareness Month, and today we are so incredibly fortunate to be joined by Dr. Jan Hasbrouk, who is here to speak to us about supporting students with dyslexia. Before we get started here today, I have a few housekeeping notes to go over. Firstly, today's webinar will be recorded and we'll email everyone with the recording link at the conclusion of today's webinar. So if you can't make it to the end, if you can't see the beginning, no worries. We'll send you the entire recording for you to have and to you to share with any of your colleagues. Secondly, we have a live captioner here with us today. So if you want to access the captions, click on the button at the tray down below that says CC, and you will be able to access those captions. We also welcome questions and comments. If you have a question at any time during our session here today, make sure to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the tray there, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can during our time here today. If you have, and some people are already putting where they're from in the chat because they know the drill. We always love to use the chat to collaborate, but at the start also drop where you're from in there just to get to know each other a little bit better here. We're already seeing lots of representation from all over the United States, which is great to see there. Awesome. And then the chat will also be used today. Dr. Hasbrouk has a lot of session handouts for us today, so keep an eye out on the chat for those handouts as she mentions them. Awesome. So now that that's out of the way, I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce our expert speaker here today that we are so happy to have. Dr. Jan Hasbrouk is a researcher, educational consultant, and author. One of her recent publications is, of course, very relevant to today's webinar, Conquering Dyslexia, a guide to early detection and intervention for teachers and parents. Dr. Hasbrouk was a reading specialist and literacy coach for 15 years before teaching at the University of Oregon at Texas A&M University. Dr. Hasbrouk has provided educational consulting for schools around the globe, helping teachers, specialists, administrators, design and implement effective assessment and instructional programs targeting for helping low-performing readers. You may have joined us for Dr. Hasbrouk's session on dyslexia as part of the Science of Reading is for Everyone series last February. Today's webinar will build upon the learnings from that session and more deeply dive into instruction to support students with dyslexia. If you have not already seen that session, no worries. The content in today's webinar will still be very helpful and insightful. And at the conclusion of today's webinar, we're also going to drop a link to a recording of that first session. So you can watch this session and then watch Jan's first session back in February. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jan Hasbrouk.
Thank you, Bill. Lovely to be here today to talk with you about dyslexia in the month of being aware. We're always aware, those of us who care about dyslexia, we're always aware. We don't need a special month, but it's good to focus on that. So yes, this is part 2. We have an hour to talk about all that I want to share with you today, which of course is not going to be nearly enough. If you are on Twitter, I put my handle up there so you can join a lovely growing community of folks who care about many aspects about reading, the science of reading, dyslexia, coaching as well. So if you'd like to join that conversation, it would be lovely. And that's a way to follow up on this if we don't have as much time at the end for questions and you have a particular question. Twitter's a good way to get in touch with me. So the credentials that I have, Bill talked a little bit about my professional background, that I was a reading specialist and coach. I was a professor of educational psychology at Texas A&M, with a very interesting job. I thought I was divided between working with my colleagues in special ed and at-risk and also school psychology. So I've done that kind of work for a very long time. But when we're specifically talking about dyslexia, I have a personal connection to. It's not irrelevant at all that my deep interest and my understanding of dyslexia comes not just as a researcher and a practitioner, but as a mother. My daughter Lizzie lives here in Seattle. This is Lizzie and me in my backyard in Seattle, Washington, where we live. So
Jan, I'll use that opportunity to pause you there just a bit. Do you mind resharing your slides? They are not sharing right now.
Are we not sharing? Okay, I will share that screen because you want to see Lizzie. I know you do. So
Perfect.
let's see. Are we there now?
We are there. Thank you, Jan.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to do the arrow again. There's Lizzie, my daughter. And so, and Bill also mentioned that I have written a book about dyslexia. In part one of the session that of these webinar series that I did, I focused more on what is dyslexia and assessing for dyslexia. I'm going to focus this time more on some of the aspects of teaching. But before we do that, a little bit of a reminder about what we're talking about dyslexia. So these are the kids who often, for varieties of reasons, have difficulties with accurate word recognition and often fluent word recognition. Even after they build that level of accuracy, fluency is one of the things that our children with dyslexia do struggle with. Another manifestation, very, very common, nearly universal, is difficulties with spelling, making that association in their brain between the sounds of words and the letters or graphemes that represent that. So overall, that just leads to poor decoding once they move into text. If you struggle with word reading, decoding obviously is going to be a challenge. And there's a great deal of agreement among the researchers who have dug deeply into the causality, the etiology of dyslexia, that for reasons that we're still trying to wrap our figure out about science, why is it that these children's brains have difficulty with a very narrowly focused challenge of phonological aspect down to the phoneme level often is where their problem is. Sort of a mysterious manifestation, because in general, the brains of dyslexics are perfectly competent and sometimes even gifted, but it is that one aspect. And it is very narrow and it's very small, and it causes a world of challenges in reading and spelling. That idea that it's a unique challenge, that these students with dyslexia, as I said, often have very capable brains. They're very intelligent, they're very capable, they have often multiple talents. So this one problem is often referred to as unexpected. In my book, I was able, with the generosity of Nancy Young, to share a version of her infographic, The Ladder of Reading and Writing. It's called The Ladder of Reading and Writing right now. In my book, I was used an earlier version, just focused on reading. The Ladder of Reading is in the book. But the main message of her infographic is so powerful, and it is that learning to read and write is a challenge. That idea of a ladder. The ladder has to be climbed. But the other message of the ladder is that the very positive thing that we've learned from research is that with powerful instruction, almost all of our children can successfully climb this ladder of reading and writing, but that climb is going to be very different for some students. What we know about the children we're focusing on today is that climbing this ladder, becoming proficient in reading and writing, is going to be quite challenging. So let's get started with what we know and what we can do about this. My colleague Deb Glazer and I wrote a book about reading fluency. And in that book, we defined reading as, we all know, a very highly complex task that involves many interconnected and codependent linguistic processes that draw upon a variety of separate skills. In the first part of this webinar, I went into a little bit more detail about this, but we can represent that challenge by using another very famous infographic, Hollis Scarborough's Reading Rope, where she very accurately demonstrates our understanding that the goal of reading, the target of reading, which she labels as the fluent execution and coordination of two major components, word recognition and text comprehension. So that is also what's representing what Deb and I talked about, is the multifaceted, complex aspect of learning to both read and write. We know from many researchers, including Dr. Seidenberg, we've learned about what is required for our brains, the brains of our children, to become reading and writing brains. And he and many others, Stanislas Dehaene, Marianne Wolf, many people who have studied the actual brain processes, now we understand that the brain really has to rewire itself. Learning to read for everybody requires building a new circuit in the brain, rewiring the brain. No one is born with that brain circuitry. We do, most of us are luckily born with circuitry that allows us to use our eyes, the visual circuitry, as well as the pathways that allow us to acquire spoken language. And we have to connect those two separate areas of the brain through instruction. And what we know is that rewiring, if you think of Nancy Young's ladder, is much more and much less difficult for certain brains to do. But how does that happen? How do children learn to read? And I find it very interesting. Something I've had to wrap my head around for many decades is this response, that the answer is the same for all children. It's taken me so long to think about the truth of this response, that the answer is the same for all children, because in my career, decades of work, being a mother of two children, a grandmother, I have never met two children who are the same, who do anything exactly the same, even if they're identical twins, raised in the same family. How can it be that we say that learning to read is the same for all children? And when we think about those children on Nancy Young's ladder at the top area, that dark green, those gifted readers who seem to teach themselves to read, and our students with dyslexia who struggle so hard, how can it be that the answer is the same for all children? Well, Dr. Seidenberg goes on to say, well, of course there are differences. There are differences between children that are cultural, economic, the educational circumstances that they live with, that affects their progress. But what they need to learn does not change. And we can then go back to Scarborough's rope. She does not have a different rope representing all the different things students need to learn to become readers. It's this. Every reader needs language comprehension. Every reader needs to learn how to recognize words, first through decoding and later through orthographically mapped sight words. Every reader needs this. What we do know is that some students are going to find that process very difficult. For our students with dyslexia, this is where the challenges happen. This is where that phonological awareness, making the brain aware of the individual sounds and connecting that with the visual code through instruction is what makes the big difference. But we have so much good news about this. We have researchers very currently saying that we now have enough evidence to make really positive statements about what is possible. Sharon Vaughn and Jack Fletcher say, with good instruction, we can reach very close to 95% will be reasonably successful readers. We can get almost everybody, no matter where they start, no matter how easy or hard, we can get them to the top of that ladder. Louisa Moats has come to the same conclusion. About 95% of children can be taught to read. And she's saying early is so important. We should be doing that work and getting that initial linkage between those, the language and the visual component accomplished by the end of first grade. And we know that the truth is that some of our students will climb that ladder more easily than others. Some of our students are going to have that wiring all intact by the end of first grade. Some of our children, the dark green on this ladder, come to the first stages of school already having that happened. But what we do know is even if we don't accomplish it easily and on the expected timeline, we do have skills and strategies to get us there. I'm a big fan of the work of Steve Dykstra. I hope you know his work as well. He's a clinical psychologist, actually, not a reading specialist at all, but has become deeply interested in reading in his work as a clinical psychologist who specializes in working with children who are traumatized in their childhood and adolescence. And he has found that his clients who deal with severe trauma often as well deal with reading issues. And in his look at reading research, he has come to the conclusion that because of the way our brains work, there really is no need to separate children into these labeled categories because they all need the same thing. What we know about our children with dyslexia is that not that they need different kinds of instruction, they need the same basic instruction that allows the brain to make that rewiring, that connection. They need the same thing. What we do know is the important thing is that we need to intervene effectively and robustly as early as possible and not worry so much about the label. And that was also a message of my first webinar. Now, we know in the real world, there's lots of reasons why a label of dyslexia is valuable and important. It's hard to get access to services sometimes without that label. But his message is just simply that there is nothing from the research science that says once we found a student with dyslexia, we do really different kinds of instruction. But then that leaves us with the question, what does that instruction look like? What should we be doing? And we have an answer for that because for decades now, we have probably about 50 years of really high quality research into the best practices in terms of instruction. And we've come to conclusions about some things that need to be in place so that all children successfully climb the ladder of reading and writing. And what we know is that that instruction needs to be comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, and it works better when we involve all the modalities of learning. And all of that works better when we as the practitioners are informed by data. And that's a real mouthful, isn't it? So we need instruction that's comprehensive, systematic, explicit, intensive, multimodality. So we have a shortcut term that we're using these days. You may have heard the term structured literacy. You may be an expert in structured literacy. And this multifaceted thing that we are now trying to get into the hands of all practitioners of reading can really be focused around two areas. Structured literacy addresses what needs to be taught as well as how reading should be taught. So let's start with the what first, and we can return to Scarborough's rope to do that. The what of reading is, in order to become that skilled reader that she talks about, you need to have multiple aspects of language comprehension developed, and your brain needs to learn to recognize words. And again, for our children with dyslexia, this is where the biggest challenge happens. And there's all kinds of ways to describe the development of learning to read. We have Airy and Jean Shaw and other researchers have described the development of reading. David Kilpatrick in 2015 talked about a very simple way, but I think a really accurate way of talking about reading development that's very relevant to our children with dyslexia. He says, level 1, at the first stages, the reader needs to become familiar with letter names and letter sounds. The second level is when they start to connect those two things together, the names and the sounds and the letter representation, to the decoding process that he calls phonic decoding. And then what we hope is, as quickly as possible, we can get readers to level 3, which is what most of us would recognize as real reading, that he labels the orthographic mapping. Once the brain figures out that sound letter correspondence, if everything is in place, good strong language and knowledge background, the brain can begin anchoring those words permanently in the brain as what most practitioners refer to as sight words, instantaneously recognize words that they no longer have to sound out to decode. So we can map those 3 levels of process, 3 levels of development back onto Scarborough's rope. In kindergarten and first grade, assuming that language is in place, the level 1 of learning your letter names and your letter sounds starts to happen for most of our students in kindergarten and grade 1. That phonic decoding, where we start to read words using decoding strategies, for most students, about the middle of first grade into early second grade, as we move to longer multisyllable words for that. And then somewhere around mid first grade, we hope that students move into that level 3 of orthographic mapping. What we know, now this is typical development, this is expected development. Some students will move faster than that. But we also know, we're here today to talk about our students with dyslexia, and they often spend many years in that second phase of that struggle with the accurate and fluent decoding of words. So part of the handouts today is this little chart, just to remind us about the what of structured literacy, that language comprehension and the various components need to be there. And this chart is a way for you perhaps to do some self-analysis around your own program. Are these things in place in a good, strong way? Is there some work you need to do about that? Maybe this is a conversation that colleagues could have across grade levels, because these are the what components that need to be in place for successful outcomes. Again, not just for our students with dyslexia, but for all of our students. So now let's spend the remainder of our time together on the how reading should be taught. So one of the words I used with defining structured literacy was the term comprehensive. So what do we mean by that? Partly, we need to be sure that people are addressing both components of Scarborough's rope. Some of you are likely familiar with the elegant equation from Goff and Tunmer, the simple view of reading that has evolved over time with some other adjustments to it. But the basic idea, much like Scarborough's rope represented, is there absolutely has to be these 2 things. There must be language comprehension going on in the brain. There must be a way for the students to connect the language with some symbolic representation. I've talked mostly about the visual way of doing that. Most of us learn to read using our eyes, but for our children who are blind or visually impaired, they can learn to read as well using a different way of recognizing words through a tactile system. Comprehensive also means that this complicated thing called reading, we need to be sure our students have acquired those foundational skills. They have phoneme awareness. They have learned how to map those phonemes onto graphemes or letters. They've learned to decode words and read easy text fluently. All of those foundational skills need to be there for every reader. And those are the skills that some of our students just acquire extremely easily. Our students with dyslexia often need more time with those foundational skills, but the notion of comprehensive means it can't just be foundational skills. Sometimes the science of reading does get criticized for an overemphasis on foundational skills. If you really understand the foundation or you understand the science of reading, you know that that's not true. There are people who are reading scientists who do spend a lot of their work on those foundational skills because they're so essential and because so many of our students do struggle acquiring those skills. So there is a lot of attention on foundational skills, but that is one narrow, tiny piece of the science of reading. And in structured literacy, certainly there's the acknowledgement that foundational skills aren't enough. We also, in order to truly become readers and writers, we need all those advanced skills and knowledge, and we're never done. We hope there's a point where our readers are finished acquiring, mastering their foundation skills, but never done with the acquisition of those advanced skills and knowledge. So systematic is a word that's often used in relationship to effective instruction for children with dyslexia, for structured literacy. What do we mean by systematic? Well, basically, systematic is the plan that we use for our teaching, that somebody should have thoughtfully created a scope of skills and content. How much are we going to try to teach in this kindergarten year, this initial year of instruction? How much are we going to then try to teach in the next year, the first grade year, and so on? We've got what are those foundational skills. Another part of systematic instruction is the sequence. It's not just what we're going to teach and how much we're going to teach in terms of skills and content, but a well-designed, effective instructional program. People have thought really carefully about the sequence of skills, especially at that foundation level. There are easier skills and harder skills. There are many aspects of learning to read, perhaps even more in English than in others, where there's lots of confusions. We have words that are homophones that sound exactly the same and can be confused. We certainly have those challenging letters of B, D, P, and Q. We need to be sure that we're not teaching our kindergartners those highly confused letters all on the same day. So the plan, what are we going to teach? What order are we going to teach it? Let's start with the foundational skills and move to application. And of course, we know in a classroom situation, our students have very diverse needs. They're going to learn to read basically the same way. We have to get those brains rewired, but some of our students, including our students with dyslexia, are going to need lots of review. So building that into the curriculum, not assuming that all children are going to move through the materials at the same rate. So building in lots of opportunities for review. I usually think of when I'm really thinking about what structured literacy is and the systematic aspect of it, I really think of this as being the job of the publishers, those who create the good curriculum materials, the good programs, the core materials and the intervention materials we use. It breaks my heart a little bit, actually, when I think of teachers being asked to to create their own curriculum in all their spare time, in their evenings and after school and in the summers. And if each individual teacher is doing that creation of a curriculum, that's really not allowing that interconnectedness. I want to prepare that precious time we have in kindergarten and first grade. I want to get as many children launched as possible. And so that's at least a 2-year sequence. And then what are we preparing them for in second grade? I really think that this is not the job of teachers to be thinking systematically. It's the job of whoever's creating the curriculum materials. But then the next aspect of structured literacy is very much in the responsibility of teachers. Now, we can certainly use materials that have been designed more easily to do explicit instruction, but it's my experience with decades of experience using explicit instruction that you can take these delivery strategies and use them with any kind of material, no matter how it's been designed, certainly easier with some than others. But what do we mean by explicit instruction? Well, it can be very complicated, but for the time we have today, I can boil it down to, it's often described this way. Explicit instruction involves 3 steps. We show the student what it is we want them to learn. And explicit instruction is often used with skills, basic skills, learning some skill, whether it's learning to read, whether it's learning to play golf, whether it's learning to play, I guess these days we should talk about pickleball. Everybody's learning pickleball, whether you're learning to play an instrument. It starts with somebody, an expert, showing you what it is that's expected, what this letter says, what this, how to hold the paddle in the right way, how to put your fingers on the guitar fret in the correct way. Show that first step, then practice together, often referred to in explicit instruction as guided practice. This is where I'm the teacher, I work with you, we do it together correctly. If you don't do it correctly, I'll give you a correction. I'll show you how to do it again, and we'll do it together. And we'll do the guided practice as often, as many times as necessary. And this is the big differentiator. If we think about the ladder of reading, the amount of guided practice is what differentiates how quickly students can climb the ladder. Everybody benefits from a little bit of demonstration. Some students need a demonstration, very little guided practice, and they're ready to go on. Our students with dyslexia, this is where we need lots of time, lots of patience, lots of variety, so that we can do that guided practice that they need twice, 3 times, 10 times as much as some of their more neurotypical peers, if you will. So demonstrate, guided practice. Third step is independent practice. The teacher won't always be there. If you're really going to learn how to read or how to play pickleball or how to play the guitar, you need to practice on your own for some time too. You may have heard Anita Archer and others use the terms "I do" to describe demonstration. This is my turn as the teacher. Watch me. I'm going to do it. The guided practice is we do. I'm here with you. You do it with me. We're going to practice this together. In a small group setting, this might be me working with all of the children together. And then eventually you have to do it by yourself, go practice it. And if you're still struggling, we can go back to the I do and the we do steps as necessary. So this is the way we've been thinking about explicit instruction for a long time. There's some newer thinkings. All these things evolve. You probably have heard the science of reading described as a vast body of knowledge. It's best and most accurately described as a vast, growing, evolving, changing body of knowledge, because research continues to come and inform us. So those steps of I do, we do, and you do are excellent and should be incorporated with our instruction in reading and writing. But we can also consider adding a third step after guided practice of collaborative practice that we might refer to as the y'all do step. So this is what it might look like. A teacher working with a small group of students, she can do in that small group the I do and the we do. So she demonstrates, they do some guided practice together. The collaborative practice, the y'all do, here are some students working together. Now they may be cross-skill group here at this point in the I do, we do step. Most of those students would be grouped homogeneously. They would be skill grouped together, that they're all working on one certain aspect of learning to read and write. When we get to the y'all do step, we could mix that group of kids who are a little higher up the ladder than others, and they can benefit from collaborative practice that way. They don't all have to be at exactly the same level. And then at some point, all students need to do the independent work. Now, these pictures here, at least two of them are from elementary. That y'all do step is a picture from a middle school that was doing explicit instruction in small group settings. I do definitely recommend that we think about small group and collaborative practice across all levels. There are certainly some guidance for how to do this even at the pre-K level, but we often use this organizational strategy at the elementary level, and we've found really good benefits from using it at middle school and high school as well, giving the optimal opportunity to teach skills and practice skills, but then having students work together can be highly motivating and certainly deepening their learning as well. So I use the term guided practice, and a term often used recently in reading instruction is the term guided reading. So I want to spend a minute talking about the difference between these two things. What do we mean? Well, first of all, the term guided reading is a term kind of like balanced literacy and other terms that have come to mean very different things to different people. If you are a fan of the work of Tim Shanahan, as I am, you may be familiar with his blog, Shanahan on Literacy. Once a week or so, he writes a blog about varieties of different topics. And way back in 2014, he talked about guided reading. And he said, if we think of guided reading as the idea that students should be grouped by level, a reading level, and they should be matched with their just right level of reading text, their instructional level. He said that the research, if we really look at the research on that using instructional level text for our early readers in kindergarten and first grade particularly, and often using decodable text, not leveled reading, but decodable text, is very valuable. But using instructional text, once kids attain that reading level that we hope happens in grade 2, they can actually decode. They've broken the code. They're in level 3 of reading, as Kilpatrick talks about it. They are orthographically mapping text. Just doing instruction, guided reading instruction in instructional text holds kids back. I found that really fascinating to read about that, and actually invited Tim to come speak to our nonprofit group, the Read Washington, and he's going to do a webinar, and it's this coming Saturday. So we still have room if you'd like to go to the Read Washington website and take a look at that. You could join this webinar where he's going to spend 2 hours talking about reading levels from a scientific viewpoint, the science of reading levels, and what does guided reading mean, and when should we be using instructional text, and when should we be leveling students in a different way. So perhaps you would like to join us for that. So guided practice is really not guided reading. Guided practice is the we do step in explicit instruction. And here we want to scaffold challenging reading, including comprehension, practicing fluent reading, all of those kinds of things. Once students have broken the code. For our kindergarten, first grade students, those students, whatever age they are, if they're still at level 1 and level 2 of Kilpatrick's levels, then we would really focus on decodable text. And that would be challenging reading for those students. Once the code is broken, they've moved to level 3, they're orthographically mapping text. We want to use challenging text in the we do step, not the instructional level reading once decoding is well established. So another aspect of structured literacy, I use the term intensive. This is really where we start to differentiate the use of structured literacy with our children who have dyslexia or other reading challenges, and our students who are making adequate progress. For our students who are finding this process challenging, we really need to make sure that we're embracing a sense of urgency. We don't have time to waste. We do want to use that perky pace of instruction that Anita Archer talks about. We want to be relentless. We want to say there are no excuses. Remember what Fletcher and Vaughn said, 95% of children can be taught to read. Louisa Moats, 95% of children can be taught to read. Just recently, Claude Goldenberg and Margaret Goldberg wrote an article that said, with good instruction, if we have language in place, 95% of children can learn to read. We have no excuses. Our children can do this. If we stay sufficiently focused, we teach those key skills, we make sure students acquire the knowledge and skills they need to meet those standards. That's what we need to be doing. We also know that active engagement is part of what we might consider intensive instruction. Children learn best when the teachers do minimum talking, just enough to demonstrate and provide the guidance that they need. Students learn across the ladder from doing. At first, we need to be sure that they're doing mostly oral reading. And as quickly as we can, we want to get to connected text, not just learning to read isolated words, which is foundationally important. Of course, we need to do that, but we want to get the students to connected text absolutely as quickly as possible. As soon as they can read 2 or 3 words, we want to put those into meaningful sentences and do that kind of work. As part of the active engagement, we want a pen or pencil or a felt pen or something in students' hands, because the growing body of evidence that if we have students learn to decode words and then encode the word, trace the word, write the word, spell the word, it can greatly enhance making those neural connections in the brain. So that's another part of activity. Hear the word, say the word, write the word with as much guidance as possible. You don't have to do that without a lot of support. We want students talking, discussing, sharing, commenting, using their language. This is especially important for our English learners, but that's another great value of that collaborative step, that y'all do step. Those students should be in those group talking about what they're learning and sharing and discussing and supporting each other. It's all really beneficial. And finally, the component of multimodal. And that may be a new word for some of you, a newer term. For over 100 years, those early pioneer researchers who started to look at our children with dyslexia, finding those children and trying to figure out what worked with them, started using processes that did involve, of course, very importantly, phonics and decoding. They started teaching these dyslexic students how to sound out words, how to connect the sound of the word with the letter and use those together. But in the early stages, like over 100 years ago, they tried out doing phonics with some sensory additions, like having the students write in the air, or having students trace letters that were cut out of sandpaper, or tracing letters or writing letters in tactile media, like sand boxes, or rice bowls, or rice trays, or shaving cream, all of those sensory things that are still used today. But now we have, those did seem to work, but we have better research methodologies these days that is starting to try to piece out what aspects of that instruction is really working. And what's being found is that what was really working in that instruction was the explicit systematic instruction of this sound, this letter represents this sound, and this is how we say it. It was less the sensory aspects of it. But we have found that using all of the sensory modalities when someone is learning to read and write really does improve skill development. But it's not the sandpaper and it's not the rice trays. It is the seeing, hearing, speaking, and doing some kind of touch, movement, or kinesthetic kinesthetic activity that does make the difference. So if instruction is more thoughtfully planned to make sure that we're using all those sensory modalities. So an example might be for a very beginning reader, we want them to learn to read the word mug. So I might start with the oral activity and the speech activity. I would ask my students, and this might be in a small group instruction, everybody say mug. And they would all together chorally unison response. So there's an active engagement there. They're hearing it, they're saying it. Then, because of Scarborough's rope and the simple view of reading, we don't just want to do phonics. We want to be sure that even at the beginning that we're connecting words with meaning, because that's the whole purpose of reading. So I might spend a moment just saying, what is a mug? And if I might have some pictures of a mug, or with really young students, I might have a few mugs there for them to see and hold. We don't want to ever just use one mug. If I showed them that this is a mug, they might forever think, okay, a mug is a cup, a white cup with a handle. So we want to show varieties. This is especially important for our children whose experience in the world might be less, our students who are English learners. These kinds of things can be very valuable. We don't have to spend a lot of time on it, and it certainly works most readily, easily with something really concrete like mug. But what is mug? Okay, then moving on, we're going to connect the phonemes with a kinesthetic, the phoneme awareness with kinesthetics. I've previously talked about syllables, 1, 2, 3 syllables, that auditory work. So they know the answer to this. How many syllables in mug? Let's clap. 1, they clap for 1 syllable. Now we do some kinesthetic with some oral, bringing in the my turn, I do it, we do it, you do it. How many sounds in mug? Mug. Let's say the sounds in mug, and I might hold up 3 fingers or popsicle sticks or use Elkonin boxes. G. There are 3 sounds, and now we want to blend them together. It's that segmenting and blending that the research says is very valuable. So we blend those sounds together. We connect the phonics and decoding with letters. Now start with the sounds, activate the sound. What sound do you hear at the beginning? What's the last sound? What's the middle sound? And then we bring in the letters. Then we can do some kinesthetic work. The students have their whiteboards ready. And I want you to write an and an and a g. And of course, we want students to be successful at this, so I can show them the letters so they can copy them if they need to. For some students, I will have pre-prepared this activity, so all they have to do is trace those letters. And now they've written the word and we can decode it. Let's read the word you wrote, sound it out, say the word. And we can move to an advanced phoneme awareness. If we're doing a whiteboard, I can say, okay, you wrote the word mug. Now I want you to erase the G that you wrote and write a D. And of course, again, I would have a model of that. We have a new word there. Let's read the word mud. Now we have mud, and we can talk about the meaning of mud. So this would be an example of a multi-modality early reading lesson. But we can carry that up to when students are reading multi-syllable words, things like transformation, say it out loud, everybody answers. We can count the syllables, transformation. We can now bring in morphology at the see, say, and write level. We can break this down. Trans has meaning of across or through or change. Form means to shape. Ation at the end of a word indicates an action or process. So transformation, we see it, we say it, and we write it. It's the action or process of changing shape. So we can bring that. They're writing it, they're seeing it, they're saying it, they're learning the meaning of these words. Multi-modality instruction. So another piece of your handout, another component that we included is this little chart of how. Again, just taking some of these components that we've identified from structured literacy, that comprehensive aspect that it needs to include both the foundational skills as well as the advanced skills. It needs to be addressing both aspects of the simple view of Scarborough's rope, the language, as well as the word recognition and decoding, systematic instruction, which has a strong evidence base, well-planned scope and sequence, lots of opportunity for review. Is that strong in the programs you're using? Is it somewhat represented? Is it weak? What can we do about that? Explicit instruction, I do, we do, y'all do, you do. Are we doing that in a way? Are all our teachers doing that in a way that is really strong? Is it something we should be working on? The intensity, which varies. Intensity should vary. We need little bits of intensity for the students who are thriving. We do not need those students who are thriving and doing so well to do that same level of repetition and practice. We can do harm to those children. We can hold them back. We can lower their interest in reading by making things more too intensive, doing the dosage incorrectly. But our students with dyslexia need so much intensive instruction. That can be a real challenge. How do we figure out how to differentiate our instruction in terms of that aspect? And then the multimodality, moving away from the multisensory, which has is not showing in the newer research that it has those benefits to students, but multimodality certainly does, and we can get really creative about how we can bring in the seeing and the hearing and the speaking and the writing and do that. All students benefit from that for sure. So that brings me to the end. I guess I wasn't showing my slides at the beginning when I talked about joining me on Twitter. And I do say us because the Twitter community that I have growing, it's all about reading. We don't do any politics or cute cat videos. You can find that maybe somewhere else on Twitter. I'm sure you can. We just talk about reading, research, and structured literacy, and good articles that we should share, and upcoming webinars and those kinds of things. So, or my email is another way to get in touch with me, janhasbrook@gmail. So thank you all so much for your participation here today. And it looks like we do have some time. So I'll stop sharing my screen and see if we have some questions.
Well, and thanks again, Jan. That was fantastic. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and we do have some time to answer. So if you could speak to a couple of these, they would be great.
Great.
One of the most popular, and there was a few questions about this, is in relation to teaching letter names and the scope and sequence.
Yeah.
Based on when letter names versus sounds versus grapheme and phoneme mapping. So do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Well, I will tell you what I know from research on that, and it's unclear. So we need more research on that. I would think, that that's such a minor part. It's so early in this process. Should we do letter names first, or should we do letter sounds first, or what order? All of that order is something also there is not consensus around research. The main consensus I hear is that we're never going to find the perfect order. There are many sequences that have found to be effective, and they're most effective when we do teach the highly useful letters first. In English, we just don't use X and J and Y as often as we use A and M and S. So if our goal, which it is to get kids reading meaningful text, we want to use those high utility letters and sounds first. But should we teach letter names first, get letter names all learned, and then do sounds? Should we do the letter name and the letter sound together? Should we forget letter names and just do letter sounds? There are successful ways of teaching that have done all of those things. So we don't really know yet. And there may be that there isn't one way of doing that. What we do know, what the consensus is that this incredibly complex thing we're trying to teach, we want to get students launched as quickly as possible. Eventually, we're going to need to get to that letter sound combination. So getting there as quickly as we can, how we do it doesn't seem to make a huge difference.
Well, thank you. And hopefully that makes sense for all of those and the folks that were asking. There was Heather posed a great question. You spoke a lot about the 95% of the children that we can get reading proficiently. She was asking about what about those other 5%? What happens with those children? Do you mind speaking to that a little bit?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And we do need to be careful and cautious about when we're talking about those goals. If we use that term proficient reading, if we're using that terminology the way that the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP tests, uses proficient, those are our top readers. And the truth is, we may not be able to get 95% of students being able to read at the most proficient level. What most people agree on when they're saying the 95 is we can get them reading successfully. We can get them reading at grade level or very near to grade level. So I want to be very accurate about what we're really able to accomplish. But that 5%, those children are almost always unable to even acquire basic reading skills because of language deficits. That's almost always the issue. And some of the children in that 5% are we can identify them the day that they're born. We're talking about children often with very severe cognitive limitations, often due to genetics or birth anomalies or those kinds of things. So when we're talking about the entire population, that 5% is a really small percentage. And in general, it is deficits with if they do not have the cognitive ability to acquire language at a level that we would consider typical or advanced, then reading and writing then are going to not be available to them despite our best efforts. But in that population, those people who work with our children who are severely neurologically impaired, we know some of those children can acquire quite a few basic skills, but it's that getting the level of adequacy is probably unavailable to them. But let me just say, we need to still be working on the 95% because there are very, very few schools and we certainly don't have any states that have reached that yet, and very few districts that have just reached the 95%. We've got a lot of work to do to get there. So, but we can, that's the good news. But yeah, let's focus on getting this job done for the most children possible.
Well, that's a great point, and I think with that, we don't have any more time for any more questions. Okay. But as Jan said earlier in the webinar, she is active on Twitter, so we put her Twitter handle in the chat. But if you have any questions that we did not get to today, please feel free to reach out to Jan via Twitter. Again, for everyone on the call here today, you will receive a recording of the session. You'll receive all the slides that Jan used today, and you will also receive a certificate of your attendance for your time here today as well. So thank you again so much for joining us. Jan, thank you so much for providing your insights and your expertise here for us today. We hope to see you all again very soon at an upcoming webinar. And with that, I wish you a happy Monday.
Thank you.